Today we're going to learn how to fully rebuild our 2007 to 2008 Honda CRF 450. First, we're going to start off by removing the right engine guard. Use a 10mm socket to remove the engine guard bolt. Next, use an 8mm socket to remove the coolant drain bolt while having a catch container at the ready. Remove the radiator cap so the coolant system can fully drain. After the coolant has drained, we will drain the engine and transmission oil. Grab a catch pan and use a 12mm socket to remove the transmission oil drain bolt. Next, remove the engine oil drain bolt using a 12mm socket and drain the engine oil. While we are in this area, go ahead and use a 10mm socket to remove the remaining engine guard. Now that the fluids are out of the bike, we're going to take off the seat by removing the bolts on each side of the bike using a 10mm socket or a T-handle. Something to keep in mind throughout the rest of the video is to keep all the parts and hardware organized so that you don't get confused when reassembling. Slide the seat back so that it clears the front slot and remove it. Next, use an 8mm socket to remove the bolts securing the tank cover to the radiators. Make sure the fuel petcock is turned to the off position. Then, with the help of a pair of needle nose pliers, gently remove the fuel line from the petcock. Using an 8mm socket, remove the bolt securing the petcock to the frame. Use an 8mm socket to remove the bolts securing the right-hand tank cover. Using the 8mm socket, remove the remaining bolt securing the tank to the frame. Remove the clip which secures the rear of the tank to the frame. Then pull the fuel tank breather hose out of the steering stem. Carefully feed the petcock through the frame and remove the fuel tank from the bike. Next, we're going to remove the right side panel. Use an 8mm socket to remove the right side cover lower bolt. Slide the right panel back and remove it. Now we're going to remove the muffler. Use a 10mm socket to loosen the top muffler hanger bolt. Next, use a 12mm socket to remove the last muffler bolt. My bike has an aftermarket muffler which doesn't use a band clamp to clamp the muffler to the head pipe. Yours probably does, so go ahead and loosen the band clamp. Once you've got the band clamp loose, pull straight back on the muffler and gently twist from side to side until the muffler slides off. We're going to remove the head pipe next. The head pipe nuts can be tricky, so you may need to experiment and use a combination of extensions, socket lengths, or a U-joint drive to help loosen them if you don't have a nice T-handle. Once you've got the nuts off, pull the flange back off the studs and remove the head pipe. Don't forget to remove the gasket too. Next on the list of items to remove is the rear subframe. Start by using a 12mm socket to loosen the lower right subframe bolt. Transition to the left side of the bike and use a Phillips screwdriver to loosen the hose clamp securing the airbox boot to the carburetor. Disconnect the breather hose from the airbox. My bike happens to be missing the spring clip, but I'm assuming yours will be equipped with one, so grab a pair of needle nose pliers to help you move the clip off the barb. Proceed to use a 12mm socket to remove the left lower subframe bolt. Use a 10mm socket to remove the remaining rear subframe bolt. Rest firmly on the rear subframe and pull straight back until the airbox boot is no longer secured to the carburetor. Keep your eye out for the airbox hose clamp as it has a tendency to come off as you remove the rear subframe. Disconnect the TPS sensor plug. Look carefully where my fingers are on my left hand and notice my left thumb pushing down on the catch tab as I pull the plugs apart. Once again, my spring clip is missing on my breather hose, but I suspect your bike will have a spring clip here. Use a pair of needle nose pliers to help you pull the clip off the barb. Tuck the hose out of the way. I secured my stator wires to my fuel line with a zip tie. You might not have this, but if you do, use the appropriate tool to unsecure the wires. Push the fuel line through the guide on the frame and rotate the tube out of the way. Use a Phillips screwdriver to loosen the hose clamp securing the carburetor to the cylinder head. Pull straight back on the carburetor until it dislodges from the intake manifold. Once the carburetor is free, watch carefully as I slide the carb to the side and up so that I can gain easy access to the throttle and hot start cables. Be gentle and take your time as you bring the carb up. As you tilt the carb, some fuel may want to drain out, so have a catch pan at the ready. Use a small flathead screwdriver to slide the hot start boot back from the cable. My hot start plastic fitting stripped a long time ago, so I machined one from aluminum and will use a pair of vice grips to loosen it. If you still have the plastic fitting, grab the appropriate size open end wrench or carefully use a pair of pliers to loosen it. Once loose, remove the hot start cable from the carburetor and tuck it out of the way. Turn the carburetor over onto its other side. We're now going to remove the Allen head bolt securing the cable cover to the carburetor. Use a 4mm Allen wrench to loosen the bolt. Remove the cover by pulling it straight up and away from the carb. Now we need to remove the throttle cables. Use a 10mm open-end wrench to loosen the first cable. Loosen it just enough so that you can slide the cable end out of the slot. Rotate the cable around so that the cable aligns with the notch in the wheel and pull the ball out. Loosen the second cable with the 10mm wrench until the cable end clears the slot in the carburetor. Once out, rotate the cable until it aligns with the slot in the cable wheel and pull the ball end out. Now that the carburetor is free, we can set it aside. Next, remove the radiator shrouds by gently bending them in so the circular tabs clear the holes in the radiator. Once you've got the left side out, go ahead and remove the right shroud as well. Use a Phillips screwdriver to loosen the hose clamp securing the radiator hose to the top of the right radiator. Proceed to loosen the hose clamp at the bottom of the right radiator. Use your screwdriver to loosen the hose clamp securing the coolant hose to the water pump outlet. Pull the coolant hose off the water pump outlet. Then, pull the coolant hose off the lower right radiator fitting. Finally, pull the coolant hose from the top right radiator fitting. Use a Phillips screwdriver to loosen the clamp securing the radiator overflow tube. Use a small screwdriver to help push the coolant overflow tube off the fitting. Use an 8mm socket to remove the lower radiator mounting bolt. Remove the bolt, then proceed to remove the upper mounting bolt and remove the radiator. Transition to the left side of the bike and loosen the hose clamp securing the coolant hose to the top of the left radiator. Pull the coolant hose off the upper radiator fitting. Use your Phillips screwdriver to loosen the coolant hose from the cylinder head fitting. Once loose, pull the hose free. Remove the coolant hoses from the bike, making sure to keep track of the hose clamps as well. Loosen the remaining hose clamp on the lower left radiator fitting using a Phillips screwdriver. Use an 8mm socket to remove the lower left radiator mounting bolt. Remove the bolt, then proceed to remove the upper mounting bolt. Then, remove the radiator and set it aside. Keep your 8mm socket handy and remove the lower ignition coil mounting bolt. remove the upper ignition coil bolt by using your socket and securing the nut on the back side of the bolt with the 10mm wrench. Gently pull the plug cap out of the spark plug hole and remove the black wire connected to the ignition coil. Depress the rear brake and use a 12mm socket with a braking bar to loosen the front sprocket bolt. Once loose, untighten the rest of the way and remove the bolt and washer. Pull the front sprocket off the output shaft. Then, carefully work the chain off the sprocket and remove the sprocket. Use two 10mm open-end wrenches to loosen the clutch cable lock nut. Then use your fingers to rotate the lock nut all the way down. Once the lock nut is out of the way, use your fingers to rotate the cable adjuster all the way down as well. By shortening the cable housing, more slack is created in the clutch cable, allowing for easy removal. Use a pair of needle nose pliers to help remove the end of the cable from the clutch arm by feeding the cable through the slot in the arm. Use an 8mm socket to remove the two bolts securing the clutch cable bracket to the engine. You'll also need to temporarily remove the oil fill cap to gain access to the front bolt. Remove the cable from the clip and let it sit to the side. Reinstall the oil fill cap. Use an 8mm socket to remove the pinch bolt clamping the shift lever to the shaft. Wiggle the shift lever back and forth to help free it from the shaft. Temporarily reinstall the transmission drain bolt using a 12mm socket. Then reinstall the engine oil drain bolt. Reinstalling the drain bolts will prevent any remaining oil from making a mess when we remove the engine from the frame. Move back to the right side of the bike and remove the trio of coolant hoses. Use a 12mm socket to remove the kickstart pedal bolt. Wiggle the pedal back and forth to facilitate removal. Use an 8mm Allen head socket to remove the brake pedal bolt. Once the bolt is removed, let the pedal hang to the side. Pull apart the 4 wires connecting the stator to the CDI box. Tuck the wires up out of the way. Next, we're going to remove the cylinder head engine mount hangers and bolts. First, use a 14mm socket with the braking bar and a 14mm wrench to loosen the lower cylinder head mounting bolt. Once loose, remove the nut, but wait to pull the bolt until after we loosen the upper hanger bolts. Use a 12mm socket to remove the upper hanger bolts. Remove the lower bolt at this time. Don't forget to grab the 2 spacers as you slide the bolt out. Move to the right side of the bike and use your 12mm socket to remove the last 2 engine hanger bolts. Next, we will remove the front engine mount bolts. Start by using a 14mm wrench, 14mm socket, and breaker bar to loosen the front engine mount bolt. Then, use a 12mm socket and 12mm wrench to remove the bolt securing the front engine mount brackets. Finally, loosen the lower mounting bolt. Then, remove both brackets. Use a 14mm wrench, 14mm socket, and braking bar to loosen the lower engine mount bolt. Once loose, remove the bolt and slide it out. I've now got the bike off my lift and in a spot where I'm comfortable pulling the engine out. Use a 22mm socket and breaker bar to loosen the rear swing arm bolt. Once loose, remove the nut. Use a 5/16 inch punch and a hammer to tap the pivot bolt partway out. Be careful not to hit any of the pivot bolt's threads. Remove the washer if you haven't already done so. Now that the bolt is started and we can get a grip on it, we really shouldn't need to use the hammer anymore. Use your right hand to pull on the pivot bolt while using your left to help align the swing arm so that the bolt holes align and it comes out easily. Once you get everything aligned, the bolt will come out smoothly. Let the swing arm fall back out of position. We will need this extra space to remove the engine. Now is a good time to check over the engine and make sure we didn't miss anything before we pull the engine out. Pull the hot start cable out of the way and let it hang off to the sides, along with the pair of throttle cables. Position the breather hose so that it won't interfere with the frame as we remove the engine. There's a special technique to easily getting the engine in and out, so watch carefully here. We need to lift the rear of the engine up over the swing arm and then tilt the front of the engine down while we start to rotate the rear of the engine out on the right side of the frame. You'll notice now that the engine is partway out that the rear of the engine will just clear the frame. However, the exhaust stud at the front of the engine will interfere with the frame. We need to reposition our hands so that we can continue pivoting the rear of the engine out while lowering the front of the engine and rotating it down so that the cylinder head clears the frame. Once the engine is out, I like to thoroughly clean the outside of the engine before opening it up. By cleaning the engine, this helps prevent any loose dirt from falling off the engine and getting inside as we're taking parts off. I'm going to start by removing the right cover. Loosen the right cover bolts in an even pattern so that the pressure is relieved evenly from the mating surfaces and the chances of any parts warping is minimized. Once you've got all the bolts loose, remove them. Grasp the cover near the water pump and kickstart and gently wiggle it back and forth to free it from the gasket. Once free, pull the cover straight back so that the cover doesn't bind in the dowel pinholes or on the kickstart shaft. Try to keep the gasket intact and to either the crankcase side or the cover side as you remove it. Be sure to grab your water pipe and O-ring from either your crankcase or right cover and set it aside. Use a penny to lock up the clutch and primary gear so that the clutch plates can be removed. Use a 10mm socket to loosen the clutch spring bolts in an even crisscross pattern. Using the crisscross pattern will relieve pressure evenly. Once loose, remove your clutch springs and bolts, then set them aside. Use a flathead screwdriver to gently pry the outer clutch pressure plate free. Grab the washer from the pressure plate if it's stuck to the inside. Remove the bearing, collar, and push rod from the inside of the primary shaft. Use a hammer and a flathead screwdriver to pound the lock washer tabs away from the clutch nut. Remove all the clutch discs and pressure plates. Secure the clutch hub in place using a pair of clutch hub pliers. Use a 27mm socket and braking bar to loosen the clutch nut. Remove the clutch nut and lock washer. Take the clutch pliers off, then remove the clutch hub. There will be a washer between the clutch hub and clutch basket, so make sure you grab that too. Next, remove the clutch basket, the bearing, and the sleeve. Keep all these parts together and set them aside. Pull the idle gear and collar off the secondary shaft. Pull out the kickstart spring from the crankcase. Gently pull on the kickstart shaft and remove the kickstart assembly from the crankcase. Keep the kickstart assembly together. Pull the shift shaft through the crankcases, rotating the shaft as you pull. Don't forget to grab the washer if it didn't come out with the shaft. Next, we're going to remove the shift plate by removing the two bolts using a 10mm socket. Remove these two parts together so the pawls, springs, and plunger don't come flying out. If you happen to slip up and they come out, it's not the end of the world. They go back together easily. Use a 12mm socket to remove the shift drum bolt. Then remove the drum center. Be sure to keep track of the dowel pin that goes between the drum center and shift drum. Clean up any remaining oil in the right side crankcase that you can get at so less of a mess is made when you start working on the left side. Spin the engine around. Then loosen the stator cover bolts in an even pattern using an 8mm socket. Use a 12mm socket for the engine oil drain bolt. Once you have all the bolts loose, you can remove them all and set them to the side. Sometimes the stator cover will start to come off if you pull firmly and evenly on it. If not, use a 1/4-inch punch and hammer to lightly tap on the designated tab to break the cover free. Once free, pull the cover off firmly to overcome the magnetic pull of the flywheel. Use a pair of needle nose pliers to remove the stator cover dowel pins if they didn't come out with the cover. Use a strap wrench to secure the flywheel. I like to align the end of the strap wrench with the raised timing mark on the outside of the flywheel to help the wrench grip. If you're having trouble maintaining tension and bite on the flywheel, here are a couple other strap wrench variations that might help. The first variation is commonly used on thin-walled tubing, and the second variation is more commonly used on very thick tubing. Start with the first if you're having trouble and work from there. Use a 17mm socket and a braking bar to loosen the flywheel nut. Once loose, remove the nut and the washer. Use a flywheel puller to remove the flywheel. You'll notice the oil jet at the end of the crankshaft. Your flywheel puller should have a special end on it to avoid damaging the oil jet. I had the resources to make my own puller, but I'm sure you've got one from a reputable manufacturer. Thread your flywheel puller into the flywheel. My setup is a little different since I didn't machine flats into my puller. Hold the puller in place with your wrench and tighten down the puller shaft until the flywheel pops off. Carefully pull the flywheel straight off the crankshaft. Use a flathead screwdriver to pry the key out of the keyway on the crankshaft. Next, I'm going to remove the cylinder head cover by using a 10mm socket to remove the 3 cylinder head cover bolts. Pull the head cover away from the cylinder head and set it aside. Use an 8mm Allen head socket to rotate the crank and balance shaft gears until the punch marks on the gears align. This will set the engine to top dead center and ensure the valves are closed so that there is no pressure on the cam carrier when we remove it. Use a Phillips bit socket or screwdriver to remove the cam chain tensioner cap screw. Next, you'll want to use your do-it-yourself cam chain tensioner tool. Feel free to pause the video and reference this frame, or use the provided instructions in your download to create your own cam chain tensioner tool. Using your cam chain tensioner stopper tool, turn the tool clockwise to take the tension off the cam chain. The DIY tool can easily slip out of the slot, so I like to use a pair of pliers to help keep it positioned as I twist. Once you can no longer turn the tensioner in any further with the tool, push the tool forward into the slot so that it stays in place. Since we'll be servicing the head, we won't worry about checking our valve clearances at this time. Use an 8mm Allen head socket to secure the crankshaft, then use a 6mm Allen head socket to loosen the cam gear bolts. With 7 to 08 owners, your cam gear has the auto decompression mechanism on the gear, however the disassembly process is the same. Once the bolts are loose, remove them. Then, lower the cam gear down into the cylinder head and pull the chain off the gear. Don't worry about retaining the cam chain. Use a 10mm socket to loosen the 4 cam carrier bolts in an even crisscross pattern. Again, the even crisscross pattern will help relieve the pressure on the cam carrier, reducing any chances of warping. The cam carrier is located to the head with a pair of dowel pins. Gently lift straight up on the carrier and wiggle it from front to back if it doesn't pull up right away. Be careful not to apply too much lateral force as you pull up, because this will lighten the chances of the dowel pin holes enlarging, making the fit more sloppy the next time around. As you remove the cam carrier, check to see if either of the lifter buckets or shims have come out with the carrier. Use a pen magnet to pull each shim away from its keeper. Use a pair of vernier calipers or 0 to 1 inch micrometer to measure the thickness of each shim. Record your measurements on the worksheet provided in your download. Continue to remove, measure, and label on your diagram the thickness and location of each shim. Set your diagram with your shim measurements, shims, and buckets aside until we need them for reassembling the top end of the engine. Next, use an 8mm socket to remove the 2 exterior cylinder head bolts. Continue using the 8mm socket to remove the exterior cylinder bolt. Use a 14mm socket and a breaker bar to loosen the cylinder head nuts evenly in a crisscross pattern. Using a crisscross pattern will relieve pressure on the cylinder head and cylinder mating surfaces in a gradual, even way, reducing the chances of the head warping. Once all the pressure is off the nuts, go ahead and fully loosen them. I find it easiest to use a pen magnet to grab the nuts and washers once they're loose. Grasp the cylinder head at the front and rear and gently pull up on the head. The head has 2 dowel pins aligning it with the cylinder, so it will need to be pulled straight up. You may need to wiggle the head back and forth a little bit to help free it up. I've got a dowel pin that is sticking, making my head difficult to remove. Be sure to grab the dowel pins after you remove the head. If you're having trouble removing the pins, use a pair of needle nose pliers to gently pull them out. Unfortunately, as you can see, my pin is stuck pretty good, so I'll have to deal with it later. Go ahead and remove the head gasket next. Pull up and remove the front cam chain guide. Once the guide is out, pull the cylinder straight up. Then, position one of your hands underneath the cylinder so that you can catch the piston assembly as it becomes free. Remove the base gasket and cylinder dowel pins. Now we're going to remove the right hand piston pin circlip. Pay careful attention to my technique here. Insert a pick in the dimpled hole in the piston so you can get the pick behind the circlip. At the same time, use the middle finger on your left hand to push against the piston pin so that the clip can't work its way back into the piston bore. Once you've got the pick behind the circlip, use your thumb on your left hand to hold it in place while you come in with a pair of needle nose pliers using your right hand. Depending how worn the top end is, you may or may not be able to push the piston pin out by hand. There have been times where I can't get the pin out by hand and have to use a socket, extension, and mallet to help push the pin out. In this example, I'm using a punch to help push the piston pin out. However, you could also use a socket and an extension to help push it through. We don't have to push the piston pin all the way out, just far enough so that it clears the rod. In case you're having trouble getting your piston pin out, I want to show you this example where I had to use a socket, extension, and mallet to get the pin out. I really don't like to put much lateral force on the rod bearing or crank bearings, so if you have to tap on the pin, don't pound real hard. Here's a clip where I had to pound on the pin. You'll notice how my left hand is supporting the lower portion of the piston and rod, absorbing most of the blow of the mallet and minimizing the amount of lateral force being applied to the lower end bearings. Now that the top end has been removed from the engine, we can finish up disassembling the bottom end. Temporarily reinstall the clutch basket, bearing, and sleeve so that the primary shaft and balance shaft can be locked out. Use a nickel 14mm socket and breaker bar to loosen the primary shaft bolt. Some of you might notice we could skip putting the clutch basket on and lock out the balancer gear, but this is a no-no as the primary gear bolt is torqued much higher than the balance shaft nut, and the teeth on the primary gear are much stronger than the balance shaft gear arrangement. Insert the coin between the balance shaft gears and then remove the balance shaft nut with the special 4-prong socket and breaker bar. Remove the clutch basket, bearing, and sleeve and set them aside. Remove the primary gear bolt. Then remove the balance shaft nut, washer, and counterbalance. Next, remove the balance shaft gear. Remove the primary gear and crankshaft balance gear. Rotate the engine around so that you have access to the left side. We're going to remove the balance shaft next. The balance shaft won't come out when the counterweight is down because the shaft will catch on the oil pump. Rotate the counterweight 90 degrees so that it is facing the front of the engine. Then pull the shaft out. Use a pair of snap ring pliers to carefully remove the snap ring off the oil pump gear. Once the snap ring is off, pull the oil pump gear off the shaft, being careful to retain the pin as you take the gear off. Keep all the parts together and set them aside. Use an 8mm socket to loosen the cam chain guide plate. Continue using the 8mm socket to remove the oil pipe retaining bracket. Carefully pull the oil pipe assembly out. Use a 10mm socket to remove the cam chain guide bolt. Remove the cam chain guide, washer, and collar. Lower the cam chain out and around the crankshaft and remove it through the slot in the crankcase. Use an 8mm socket to remove the 2 chain guard bolts. Continue using the 8mm socket to to remove the clutch arm retainer plate. Pull the clutch arm out of the crankcase. Loosen all the crankcase bolts using an 8mm socket in an even crisscross pattern to evenly relieve pressure on the crankcase mating surfaces. Use a 12mm socket to remove the transmission oil drain bolt. Once all the bolts are loose, finish unscrewing them and take them out. Don't forget to grab the 3 copper washers that are on 3 of the crankcase bolts. I know the bolts are different lengths, but don't worry too much about keeping track of the lengths right now. Just keep them together. I'll show you where they all go when we reinstall them. This concludes Chapter 1, and in Chapter 2, we'll start splitting the crankcases.